Welcome back to My BrainWise Coach. We are so excited that you've joined us for another episode. I am one of your co-hosts, Bastian.
And I'm the other co-host, Phil Dixon.
And we are so excited that you have decided to join us again on a conversation related to, really, this is part 2, Phil, where we talked last week about the art and science of effective dialogue. And we really zeroed in on active or effective listening skills. And we shared with our BrainWise friends that there were 2 other parts of effective dialogue, which were around asking great questions. And then, of course, how do we communicate or tell our perspective in a very succinct, effective way as possible? So today, we're going to be continuing that journey, and we're really going to be honing in on probably 2 parts, the last 2 parts, which is all around asking great questions. And we talked last week about open-ended question versus closed-ended questions, and then how to actually deliver some great information from our perspective. And so I want to share before we just dive right in, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, Audible, or any of those traditional podcast areas, you are getting the full episode every Monday where we have 45 minutes to an hour of conversation and how we can use the information to decode our life. On YouTube, we're using a bit of a different content strategy just because the audience seems to be mildly different, that we are loading the same episode, but we're splitting it into 3 segments. So we have segment 1 launching on Mondays, segment 2 on Tuesdays, and segment 3 on Wednesdays. And so that's going to be the cadence for YouTube moving forward, but the content is the same. And so if you choose to watch us on either of the platforms, you'll get the same information. We're just now going to be segmenting the content a little bit differently. So I wanted to share that on the front end because there may be people, Phil, who are listening on YouTube and also listening on Spotify or Apple. They're going, wait a minute, am I getting different content? Content is the same. It's just simply we're splitting it differently because strategies for different channels needs to be to match the audience. And so we're going to see how it goes. If you have feedback on it, please, of course, always let us know because we're always open to how we can make this, our show, more approachable and more accessible for all of our BrainWise friends. So with that, our 3 segments today that we're going to really unpack is the intention behind asking and telling and why our brains might default to one or the other, the balance between the 2, how to know when to ask, when to tell, and when safety will shape both of those. And then we're going to go into probably you might call it a constructive dialogue model, a coaching model, or coaching rhythm, call it the TAPS model, tell, ask, problem, solution, that we can use in all of our relationships to help us have more effective conversation. So are you ready to dive in, Phil, to part 1?
Can't wait.
Awesome. So Phil, let's start off with, most of us think we're good communicators. And actually, I used to do a workshop where we would ask people to rate down what percentage of your time are you having conversation, whether verbal, it's written, text, email, whatever. And then what percentage of that time are those conversations actually successful? And what's fascinating about it is there's always a large gap. So we think we're good to some degree, but we're not actually probably as good in some cases. So if it's true that we are so good at conversation, Phil, why do so many of our conversations still miss the mark?
Actually, there's a big difference between how we think we are effective and how other people judge us in our effectiveness. And it's a little bit like if you ask the average person, where are you in terms of how good a driver you are? 93% say I'm way better than average. You know, we're not very good at self-judgment like that. Most of our opinions about whether we were successful or not turn out not to be true. We convince ourselves we're good and we're actually not that good. So, what's actually going on? Also, we're going to delve into many of them momentarily.
I love it. I think one of the things too is probably giving a definition, Phil, of what does a successful conversation look like. And so I'll share my definition of a successful conversation. I'd be fascinated to know your definition, but I've always described it very simplistically as, that the message that I, as the deliverer, that message is delivered to the receiver in the way I intended it. Meaning that I have a message I want to deliver to you, that I want to communicate to you, and we have an intention behind it. And so I'm delivering it to you and you understand it in the way that I intended.
Yeah.
So what would your definition be?
So pretty much the same, but I'd step one step back. And so to say, if I'm having a conversation with you and I trigger that, I'm the one that triggers at least this part of the conversation off. whose job is it to make sure that's successful, make certain that we get to that point that you were saying where we've got equal understanding of the point of what we were doing? Because my contention is whoever triggers off is also responsible for ensuring its success.
I 100% agree, especially in the dynamic of if I'm going to coach here, if I'm going to have in the work context, I'm responsible as the leader for delivering effective dialogue. I think the only time, Phil, that I would probably put maybe an asterisk there is when you're in your relationship with your significant other, it's each person's responsibility to communicate in your own way, but it's your responsibility to communicate successfully your message. And I think a lot of times we expect our spouse or our partner to understand us and be frustrated when it doesn't happen. But we always should in that relationship, because there's different dynamics, of course, right? We are individually responsible for how we effectively communicate to the other person. And so it's my job to make sure that when I communicate, I'm communicating in a way that my spouse understands me and vice versa.
Yeah. And it's what you intend. We're talking about all sorts of things. So let's step back a moment. Obviously, there's intent. That is, you've got an intent, whether it be, I'm going to ask you a question or I'm going to tell you something. And so the intent is different quite often. The asking a question might be, I really want an answer. There's some information I'm trying to see. The other reason for asking a question is to make you think and to get some clarity around thought. Right. So we've got several things going on at the same time, but a lot of it is intent. So here's the first thing. Are we clear about our intent? Mm-hmm. Because very often we're actually not. We've got a vague idea of what we're trying to do, as opposed to stepping back and going, what's an optimum next thing? What do I need to know? What do I need to communicate? What's the purpose of what I'm about to say?
Right.
And I will turn around. I'm going to take us slightly off to one side, but I'll bring us back.
Okay.
And that is, I elected to watch some TV yesterday. I normally don't watch much in the way of TV, but there was some important things going on. And there was last week, I don't care which side of the political spectrum you are, but there was an interesting week. So it was interesting to see what was going on. And I watched an interviewer interviewing, I think it was 3 or 4 people, about 5 feet. And what was fascinating is the interviewer asked some powerful questions, but not many. And what I noticed is most of them asked a really good question. What was it that led you to that conclusion? And then they added what I'll call a leading the witness question, which is, was it because you did so and so and so? Well, now, if you've been following what we talk about, that is anchoring a point into that person's brain, right?
And their intention was maybe not to anchor something, but they wanted to leave the jury in the response, probably.
Yeah, and great journalists don't do that. They're there to get the facts, get the truth as close as they can, lead the witness. And so that's one of the things I noticed again and again. Now, may they do that deliberately? Quite possibly. To me, it's not a really effective way of asking questions.
Right.
But let's assume that this person asked a really good question. And closed-ended question was, will you support what the X was? Doesn't matter. And I timed it. And this person, the politician, responded for 4.5 minutes and never answered the question.
Yeah. Called word salad.
Word salad. And I came up with an idea. I think what we should do is have a piece of software that when the interviewer asks a question, the politician's microphone goes on to mute until they press either a yes or a no button.
We might not ever hear him talk again.
Which may not be a bad thing. But it was funny because I watched for probably about an hour before I gave up. But there wasn't one occasion when a politician actually answered yes or no to a yes/no question. And so I think we need to that's an aside, but it does illustrate the power of asking powerful questions. So again, stepping back, when you're responding to something, we'll take a look at what might be going on that influences your intent. Mm-hmm. And then when you're responding, you're either going to go into a question mode or a telling mode. And again, we're going to unpack those things in a moment.
And I think it's a great example, and maybe it's a little bit of humor too, but when we're looking at that example of conversation and asking questions, that is not what we're recommending in terms of someone's response and how you should model your dialogue after, right? We're going to go into what we believe is the most effective, because I just had this image in my mind of between two spouses, particularly, let's talk me and my husband. He asks me a close-ended question. Instead of responding with a yes or a no, I'd take him on this word salad journey. How frustrating that would be for him. And that is not a successful model for a healthy relationship. So
Not at all.
it was important to note.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that might influence you. I'm listening, and now it's time for me to respond. What are some of the things that might be going on in my head which are going to influence that? All right.
Bias, worldview, mental models.
Bias, mental models, worldview, all of those type of things. Right. Our emotions, what's been raised by what's going on, the content, the manner, all of those things will actually cause me to have different thoughts and feelings and emotions. We have a thing called the ladder of inference, is that we hear something, we interpret it through mental models and biases and filters. And then our brains aren't very good at keeping the whole thing in mind. So we basically break it down into what's the gist of it. And even that we can't sometimes remember. So we'll make a concept and then we'll make an inference from that concept. And that's what we then tend to respond to the inference rather than what was actually said or what the data was.
That's where a lot of conflict happens.
Which is a huge amount of where conflict happens. Then we haven't spent a lot of time on this in our program so far, but we are not all one character. That are different characters, depending on all sorts of things. And which actual character part of us is coming to the fore. We'll actually have a separate segment one of these days on how to identify your own characters. What stress level we're under. You're going to answer much more to be succinct and to the point if you're not under stress.
Right.
And if you are under stress, you're more likely to have a certain behavioral response, which will probably come out of habit. And so, again, stress level, a relationship and trust level. If part of my response is to give you some feedback we know only works if I'm both credible and trusted. So if I've got the intent to give you feedback, but I'm not credible and not trusted, you're literally wasting your time giving feedback. And then we're all got different neurodiversity approaches, difference between extrovert and introvert and all sorts of other characteristics like that. All of those things blend into, I'll call it a mashed potato, and that's clouding or helping one way or the other what our response, the intent behind our response.
And I think it leads to a good point, which we've talked about a little bit. Are we listening to understand or are we listening to respond? Oftentimes, right? And it's okay to have a response to something and we should respond, but we should be listening first to understand what is being communicated, reframe, clarify, paraphrase if necessary, and then move the conversation along the same pathway or along the same journey. I think we get into a lot of trouble as individuals sometimes because we are listening to respond, especially when emotions, stress, all the things you just described, when we're at heightened levels of that, our ability to say, wait a minute, let me take a step back and fully understand what's happening. We're instead now getting to a point of defensiveness sometimes, or trying to, okay, I need to respond to this for whatever reason, because the filters in which that we have been listening are now clouded.
And one of the filters we have is how comfortable we are with silence. Because most of us, especially in the Western world, don't feel comfortable with silence. And therefore we feel that there's a need to fill that silence up. And there's a rule of thumb, and I think you and I know this well enough, when we are coaching or facilitating a conversation, it's okay to have silence. If you're facilitating a group, I always count to 7. If there's nothing that comes up, I'll say, okay, it's time to either ask another question or move on or whatever it might be. allowing the silence is extremely important.
Absolutely. Especially if you're trying to understand or make sense of what's being communicated. Or I think a lot of times when someone is expressing or communicating their emotions behind something, that it doesn't necessarily meet the logic of what one person might be interpreting, but it's really just an opportunity to vent or to express, here's how I was feeling about this particular situation. A lot of times we want to jump in and we want to fix it or solve it, when in reality, it's just a moment to say, one, maybe nothing, be pause and be silent to allow the other person to fully express themselves, and then be able to say, I understand that may have you feeling that way. But it's interesting because I think we've all experienced this, where we try to then go to that doesn't fit logically with what we're communicating. Sometimes the emotional part of a conversation needs to be left to its own space to be able to say, okay, it's okay for us to experience it, and then go back after we've expressed it to, okay, now where are we trying to get to in this conversation? Because equally are as important, but the pause, I think, is oftentimes very critical in that emotional part of a conversation, to just let the space breathe for a minute, because maybe the other person needs that time to collect themselves. And that's okay. So I love it. Very good. Phil, I have one more question that for you when we talk about communication and we talk about asking versus telling. And it's in any of our conversations, why do people default to telling instead of asking?
That's a great question. We tend to have a couple of things going on. We're driven by 47 different threats, and we tend to be driven by those threats. Let's just pick a few, for example. One is going to be, if I feel like I'm got to be in control, and so the first thing I'm going to do, for some people, it's a mental model that says, if I ask you a question, you are going to assume, a theory of mind, you are going to assume, therefore, I agree with you, or I'm not very smart because I don't have an opinion. So we start as all sorts of things. Our brains are driving us the whole time there, needing to be in control, needing to prove a point, needing to be right.
Right.
All of those things are driving us. On the other hand, it's also driving us is if I've got a point of view that actually I don't feel comfortable sharing with you, I'm going to change my intent. I'm going to change my approach or whatever it might be. If I'm actually responding, I may not know how to be purposeful if my opinion flies in the face of the opinion of the group. And there's all sorts of tests that have been done that if the group automatically turns around and pushes you back against you, it's difficult to then keep on down the track that you wanted to keep on. Again, I think probably the movie said it all. It's complicated. So when you are responding, become more self-aware of what's going on, what is your intent, when can you do inquiry and exploration, and when do you want to actually make a point. Even when you talked about reframing, etc., that is actually, you made a choice and your intent is to reframe, to check in, to verify, all of those type of things. I would say coming back to what is your intent and are you self-aware enough to be able to look to that intent?
No, exactly. And I think it's one of the things that's interesting about what you were describing is telling, I think, probably makes us feel safe because it does keep us in control to some degree, or at least the illusion of feeling in control. But what's fascinating about it is connection rarely grows in control. It grows in curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're asking questions, you're obviously demonstrating curiosity. When you're telling, you're demonstrating a higher degree of control in that particular instance. And both are, in terms of asking and telling information, it's important to have a balance of both. But it's certainly, when we're trying to connect with another human being, being able to ask or remain very curious about their perspective and where they're coming from is ultimately what's going to help us create a better connection. And so again, I think it goes back to, what is your intention in that particular conversation?
And not only is it your intention, but how do you want to come across?
Right.
So let's imagine a 2x2 matrix. You've never seen one of those before, I'm sure.
Nope.
No, not in our world. But if you have it on the left-hand side, how much do you tend to spend your time asking questions, right? So it's either you're low or you're high in that intent. The other one across the bottom is the degree to which you want to spend your time telling. Therefore, you could be low orientation towards that or high. So let's come up with now, if you're low asking and low telling, what's that going to come across?
Disengaged. I don't really care.
Disengaged, bland, uninterested, wimpy, whatever you want to put on it. How's it going to come across if you always spend your time in ask mode? You the low tell and high ask orientation.
Probably that you're more whimsical in nature, I guess, maybe, meaning that do you really have an opinion on something? Are you able to offer good commentary, rich context to the dialogue? Or is there a confidence challenge maybe that's coming up? Would probably be some of my questions. It'd probably be very individual, but those are some of the general things that come to my mind in terms of how I would describe that person.
Absolutely. And I just, in my book, it's difficult to know. I can't get my arms around what it is you stand for, what your values are, if you're constantly asking questions. Now, unless they are questions which, by in and of their nature, actually tell me something about you, open-ended questions, I'm never going to get to know you.
Right.
Now, let's look at the other side of the coin, which is if somebody is always very rarely asking questions and always telling you their opinion. And I'm sure we've all met people like that.
No doubt. I would describe it as maybe controlling to some degree, depending on what it's about. Maybe there's an over exuberance of confidence, maybe also described as somewhat arrogant in some spaces, maybe a bit more selfish or self-inclined in nature. Not that describe that person is that way, but they could be presenting themselves in that way unintentionally.
Absolutely. And you didn't add the domineering. It would be, again, what is your intent about how you want to come across?
Right.
When one of the questions we often ask is, what's the legacy you want to leave? And so every time you end a conversation, walk away, you've actually added or subtracted from your legacy. So what is the legacy you want to leave with people in their mind? What do you want them to say about you? Ultimately, how would you want them to write your obituary?
Right.
You are both able to ask great questions and able to put your point of view across. And so that's what we're looking at.
Right. Which I think is a great segue into what we were going to talk about next, which is all around balance and when to ask and when to tell. BrainWise friends, that concludes segment 1, where we went through the intention behind asking and telling, why our brains default to one or the other as a part of our conversation around the art and science of effective dialogue. Stay tuned until tomorrow, Tuesday, when we release segment 2 and we talk about the balance, how to know when to ask great open-ended questions and maybe close-ended questions, how to tell or share our perspective, and how safety shapes both of those. If you like today's episode or today's segment, like, comment, share, subscribe our episode because it helps others begin to find the content and the information that we're sharing so that they too can be a part of our BrainWise community. We'll talk to you tomorrow.